So we come to our final two sessions and wrapping up an enormous amount of information. We're going to hear from Craig Tibbitts, and his topic is Coming Home, Australia's Vietnam Veterans and the Legacies of their War. Craig holds a Master's in Philosophy. He's worked at the Australian War Memorial since 2000, initially as an archivist in the Research Centre, and since 2016 with the Military History section, where he's now a senior historian. He studied library archives management and again was awarded a Master's degree in 2024. Again, he's going to talk to us about coming home. Let's welcome Craig.
Thanks, Daryl. Thank you also Andrew and everyone who's organised this conference. It's been very interesting, very interesting to learn so much, as you always do with a good conference. Just on what Daryl touched on before, after we got home from dinner, my wife advised me that I'm a long-suffering blues fan.
Come on.
Your boys are up. 15 points and there's only 2.5 minutes to go. I said, I didn't want to see the result. Anyway, we'll move on from there. I'm going to talk about the aftermath of the war and how Australia's Vietnam veterans who survived coped with their war experiences, the challenges they faced readjusting to civilian life, and the medical legacies they continue to suffer from either illness, injury, or wounds, both physical or mental. Much of what I'll cover comes from two main resources. Medicine at War by Brendan O'Keefe, published in 1994, as part of the official history series, which mainly focused on medical treatment of troops deployed in Vietnam. The other is an independent study, The Long Shadow by Peter Yule, and it was published much more recently, 2020. This mainly focused on the experiences of Australia's Vietnam veterans after the war. I worked as a research project officer on The Long Shadow, which was published, as I said, 2020. So to focus on Australia's Vietnam War, I'll discuss physical wounds, disease, exposure to chemicals, and post-war readjustment. I'll also spend some time, additional time on mental war wounds, and try to put that in perspective in Vietnam. Finally, time permitting, I'll give a bit more detail about the book I worked on, the research and project and the Long Shadow. Before I get into the aftermath of war, for those servicemen and women who survived, first some figures on those who didn't make it home. The current figure we have on the Australian War Memorial's Roll of Honour for Vietnam is 524 deaths during or as a result of service in the Vietnam War. Of course, our special days of commemoration, Anzac Day and Remembrance Day, we remember those who gave their lives. And we should consider the lasting impact of that loss on comrades and especially families. For some, it's on their minds more than just twice a year. The breakdown by service of those 524 deaths is Army, 499, RAAF, 17, Royal Australian Navy, 8. The further breakdown of that is battle deaths, 426, and non-battle deaths. This is a mixture of accidental deaths and died of illness and disease, which is 98. Physical wounds. In war, the general rule of thumb is that about 25% to 33% of battle casualties are deaths, meaning 3/4 to 2/3 are wounded and survive. Wounds in Vietnam could come from a variety of sources, including bullets, fragments from explosive projectiles, and mines that we heard about earlier today. In the First World War, the majority of casualties were caused by artillery. Second to artillery was machine guns. It was different in Vietnam, where the enemy didn't use big guns to lay down artillery barrages. Instead, they used rockets, mortars and RPGs to supplement their firepower. I don't have an exact breakdown of wounds for each type of weapon, but we do know that mines and booby traps account for 95 Australian deaths and 600 wounded, so that's about 20%. Overall, in the 10 years Australians were in Vietnam, there are about 3,000 wounded in total. The main reasons for those casualties who survived improved from about 2/3 to 3/4 was speed of medical evacuation and advancement in treatment. These were major factors in the Vietnam War. Medical evacuation or medevac by helicopter was generally so much faster than in previous wars. In emergency medicine, they talk about the golden hour, a period of time immediately after a traumatic wound, during which there is the highest likelihood that prompt medical and surgical treatment will prevent death. One example, statistics for US Army troops where mortality from abdominal wounds in World War II was 21%. In the Korean War, much more use as we heard of earlier, evacuation by chopper, down to 12%, and Vietnam down to 4.5%. So that mortality from abdominal wounds amongst US Army soldiers dropped dramatically. Another example more generally is from a sample of nearly 18,000 US soldiers wounded in Vietnam between March 1966 and July 1967. The hospital mortality rate was only 1.81%, compared with a combat zone hospital mortality of 3.3% in World War II and 2.4% in the Korean War. It's the best in history of military surgery. Such a low mortality rate. Apart from medevac by chopper to nearby military hospitals in South Vietnam, very serious cases could even be flown home to Australia, to hospitals in Australia where they could get much more specialist care. Speedy medical evacuation saved many lives that in previous years would have died. So in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, there were proportionally more wounded coming home. For some, especially those who had suffered very severe wounds, such as amputees, that meant living the rest of their lives with disabilities. Until the beginning of the 20th century, disease almost always claimed more military lives than combat did, often double or more. By far, the major killers of armies throughout the ages have been gastrointestinal infections, dysentery, cholera, enteric fever, or otherwise known as typhoid. It was not until the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 that the Prussians managed to limit deaths from disease to fewer than those by combat. But the French and the barbarians did not. It took until the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 that both sides achieved fewer deaths from disease than from combat. In Vietnam, Australian troops were coming to a country that was one of the worst infectious disease environments in the world. They faced a multitude of gastrointestinal diseases, as well as worms, hepatitis, scrub typhus, and encephalitis. Malaria presented the biggest problem. Some strains had become resistant to chloroquine and paludrin, so they introduced dapsone to combat these resistant strains. The Australian medical system in Vietnam saw nearly 1,000 hospital admissions for malaria alone. And 1968 was the worst year when there was an epidemic of 440 cases in a fairly short space of time. But they did manage to get on top of it. Soldiers also suffered from a range of skin diseases, infections and insect bites. As with other wars, venereal disease was a constant battle to be dealt with while soldiers were deployed. Total cases amongst the Australian Army in South Vietnam, both hospital admissions and outpatients combined, were just over 11,000. between 1965 and 1972. No doubt you would have to factor into those there would be some who would be multiple admissions, multiple applications, persistent strains, I suppose. With some of these infections, there was also a lingering impact which saw some veterans continue to suffer from the effects from 4 years after. Recurrent bouts of malaria could be a problem, and some diseases, some skin diseases, and some types of BD could be hard to be entirely rid of as well. Unlike the US forces in Vietnam, where hard drugs such as heroin eventually became a serious problem, especially late in the war, drug abuse amongst the Australians was pretty uncommon. Even the use of cannabis was much lower among Australian troops. It wasn't entirely non-existent, but evidence I've seen seems to indicate very low cannabis use wasn't much of a problem. I think much of that has to do with a variety of factors. Cultural, Australians haven't really caught on to drug use as early as in the United States, and I think the culture within the Australian military and the discipline also limited drug use. Army units in Vietnam were usually about a 50-50 mix, is my understanding, of regular soldiers and national servicemen. In the US Army, especially in the latter years, there were less and less regular servicemen and a higher proportion of conscripts. There were, however, other more everyday substances at play. While deployed in Vietnam, the availability of cheap cigarettes and alcohol and beer led some to develop lasting habits. Because alcohol could not be enjoyed when outside the wire on patrol in hostile enemy territory, upon return to base at New Dat, soldiers would often go on benders, their beer rations having accumulated while they were out on patrol. A ration for each man was 2 cans of beer per day, while cigarettes were supplied very cheap. I think 10 cents per packet. In many cases, you got them free as part of packages. For some, and I must stress for some, not all, this became a hard habit to break, even when they returned to civilian life, where reaching for cigarettes and alcohol in the immediate aftermath of a period of stress became the norm. Such habits in turn led to greatly increased risk of heart disease and cancer. Statistics for these conditions for the Australian Vietnam veterans were high and have remained high, especially as veterans got older and especially among those who continued such habits. On the other hand, some veterans we interviewed for the Long Shadow Project said they developed smoking habits in Vietnam, but they quit as soon as they came home. There's no one singular story, everyone's different, I guess. Following Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War, a long-running controversy over the possible health effects of herbicides on the troops emerged. Another chemical factor was insecticides. They used pretty powerful ones over in Vietnam, around the base area of New Dat and other locations such as borders at Bun Tao. This is a topic that's not been studied anywhere near as much as the herbicides, but I think it probably should have been. Unlike herbicides, soldiers were exposed to insecticides far more frequently, maybe a few times a week. They would have to go, they would have men going around spraying and stuff everywhere around the base, into the tents. There would be regular aerial spraying at the New Dat base as well. We suspect that a lot of veterans who actually say they were sprayed with herbicides, such as Agent Orange, were actually mistaken. They may have been mistaken. Rather, they were more regularly getting sprayed with insecticides. An easy mistake to make. Still, some veterans were convinced their health problems were caused by exposure to insecticides, herbicides, and that the battle for recognition and compensation went on for decades and became very bitter indeed. Most scientific studies failed to find a strong link between herbicides used in Vietnam, low levels of exposure, and the health problems claimed. Studies went on and on for decades, and eventually, both in the United States and then in Australia, governments slowly granted compensation for a small range of conditions. And as time went on, they relaxed the rules further and granted compensation for a wider range of medical conditions based on lower probabilities of causation. Level of exposure and dosage level of the contaminant dioxin have always been the most important factors in this argument, and they've always been difficult to, because there's so much variation in the two. Ultimately, stalemate set in. On the one hand, it could not be proved conclusively that Agent Orange and other herbicides caused health problems for Vietnam's and veterans and their families, but equally, it could not be proved that it had not. So ultimately, I think government slowly gave ground to veterans on this issue in the form of compensation and access to free treatment, in part to try and end the bitter arguments that have been going on for such a long time on this controversial issue. For some Vietnam veterans, the transition from soldier back to civilian was anything but straightforward. Some found it difficult to adapt to a society that seemed indifferent, while finding meaningful employment would also be a daunting task. I must stress that while I refer to some veterans facing these challenges in the aftermath of war, by no means were all affected. Many returned home and picked up where they had left off, or started afresh, going on to lead successful or at least steady lives. As for encountering hostility from civilians after returning home, while I think some of the stories have been embellished or exaggerated, I have no doubt that there's been some truth to them as well. At best was the indifference of the Australian public, their lack of knowledge and their lack of appreciation that some veterans commonly refer to. That was also a factor in veteran readjustments. To find some grounding, many veterans joined the established veterans organisations such as the RSL. There have always been stories of non-acceptance of Vietnam veterans by the RSL, and while I'm sure it's true in some cases, I believe it's one of those another of those experiences has probably been exaggerated. Indeed, the RSL maintained the largest number of Vietnam veterans. The other smaller associations had their origins in dissatisfaction with the RSL and the Department of Veterans Affairs, especially over perceived lack of action on issues such as Agent Orange, psychiatric support, and adequate benefits in general for Vietnam veterans. Yet, in many ways, I think these smaller organisations made more impact with securing benefits and treatments. Among all the sources and research we did for the Vietnam Medical Legacies, which the book long shadowed, we found both evidence of dissatisfaction among Vietnam veterans with the RSL and the Department of Veterans Affairs, but conversely, also those who experienced the opposite, saying they'd had really positive experience with both those organisations. So again, out of the veterans that we spoke to, we get a fairly broad diversity of response. I think the part of this is the natural tradition where older veterans sometimes look down on younger ones. The first World War diggers did to the Second World War guys. In turn, those generations sometimes maintain that service in Vietnam was not comparable to the World Wars. I think there was often a lack of understanding of each other's war experiences and the nature of different types of wars as well. At the time, there were different experiences and different types of stresses from one war to another. I think there were three main factors for the Vietnam War which differed from both World Wars. Firstly, it was a war fought much more among the civilian population, where it was sometimes difficult to tell friend from foe. Secondly, Vietnam was also a war fought with no front lines. Ground conquered usually was not held, which sometimes led to feelings of futility among the troops. The enemy could be anywhere around you, not just in front of you, which only added to uncertainty and stress. And thirdly, there was the matter of the sharply declining support of the public at home during the latter stages of the Vietnam War. And these things made for different kinds of stresses and morale issues, both during and after the war. It's also important to stress that the difference for regulars and nashos, those young men conscripted under the National Service Act. For regulars, especially those who served in the army for many years, if not decades, Vietnam was just a part, although a significant part, of their overall service. Also, when they came home from a tour of duty in Vietnam, regulars continued their military service in a familiar organisation and with comrades who had experienced the same. We heard much the same sentiments yesterday. It was a much different experience, and I think a lot harder for national servicemen who, after coming home from Vietnam, suddenly found themselves back in the civilian world, alone, without much support, and some found that really difficult to adapt to. For those that did struggle, whether they were ex-regulars or nashos, the difficulties often manifested in two things: alcoholism or workaholism. But for some, that worked for a while, but ultimately led to burnout and collapse. Mental health also suffered. The impact of war also affected veterans' families. For many wives, mothers and children, the war continued at home. Relationships strained under the weight of psychological trauma, physical injuries and financial hardship. Veterans who returned with mental war wounds could seem distant or emotionally numb, leaving families to deal with a sometimes fraught home environment. Some children grew up in households shaped by the war, where fathers were away for a while and returned a changed man. As the Vietnam Veterans Family Study concluded in 2014, the answer to the question of whether the service of Australian men in the Vietnam War had adverse effects on the physical, mental and social health of their sons and daughters is yes. An earlier study in 1999 had also found that children of Australian Vietnam veterans were 3 times more likely to die by suicide than the children of non-veterans, which was an alarming figure. So now I'll talk a bit more about mental warfare. All wars have resulted in soldiers suffering from mental war wounds. It's hardly surprising. Indications appear in records of writing going back to ancient times. As time went on and more evidence emerged, this doesn't mean that mental trauma caused by war was increasing over time. It's because there were more official records and personal accounts being created and surviving over time. Certainly by the time of the 19th century, there's much more evidence. For example, from the Crimean War, the American Civil War, the Russo-Japanese War at the beginning of the 20th century. And this period also coincides with the advent of a new branch of medicine called psychiatry. So more medical professionals were studying the mind and trying to figure out what was happening under stresses, including war. Lots of different terms were used during, which added to the confusion and still does. Nostalgia of the soldier's heart, Da Costa's syndrome, neurasthenia, shell shock, malingering, nervous, lack of moral fibre, combat stress reaction, combat shock, combat fatigue, and since 1980, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. All these terms, old and new, refer to a range of symptoms with some commonalities. Some refer to more immediate reaction, either before, during, or right after battle, while others refer to conditions that manifest much later, perhaps weeks, months, or even years following a particularly traumatic event. Some Australian Vietnam veterans who had also served in Korea, Malaya and Borneo found the war in Vietnam harder, more exacting and more of a mental strain. This strain tended to become more apparent as troops neared the end of their year-long tour in Vietnam. I think that was just touched on just before we went to afternoon tea. Another factor was the anxiety and mental strain from the threat of booby traps and mines. You just never knew when you might be the unlucky one. Some weapons caused catastrophic wounds, especially to the lower half of the body, so the threat of these nasty weapons played on soldiers' minds. Some veterans we spoke to recalled occasions when men in their unit had psychological breakdowns in the field and had to be evacuated. Referring to the Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, there were apparently 3 soldiers who had to be evacuated suffering from severe battle stress. I'm surprised there weren't more after such an intense and terrifying ordeal. Yet psychiatric problems never constituted a major issue during deployment. Compared to earlier wars, it seemed the incidence was lower in Vietnam. There, for example, the Australian Army recorded a total of only 500 psychiatric admissions out of more than 41,000 servicemen and women who served there between 1965 and 72. That's an incidence rate of just 1.3%. And of those 500 psych cases, only about 100 were diagnosed as actual combat fatigue, which was the common term used at that time, before PTSD came on. And roughly the equivalent of what they referred to in First World War as shell shock. But the true figure of combat fatigue or combat shock is thought to be higher. This is because different military psychiatrists have different diagnoses and methods for dealing with psychiatric cases. Some were treated more as disciplinary cases, while others were simply moved to other units or just sent home. So there was a lack of consistency there, which I think disguised the true extent of combat shock Australians have been in Vietnam. Later in the war, it became the unofficial policy of last resort to reassign soldiers who suffered psychological problems to duties back in Australia. But if it appeared psychological problems among soldiers were lower in the Vietnam War, it proved to be somewhat of an illusion. Apart from underdiagnosis and underreporting in the field, there were other factors more unique to the Vietnam War which made it different to earlier conflicts. And these included, these are some of the things we've touched on over the last 2 days, included tours of duty being limited to 1 year instead of the duration of the war, the speed of return to civilian life after deployment, and differing replacement systems. For the latter, the Americans replaced individuals in units as vacancies occurred, while Australians generally deployed those entire units for their year-long tours. The other factor that must be understood regarding the Australian Army is that not everyone in a unit deployed to Vietnam en masse and returned home altogether. For national servicemen, when their 2 years was up, they were sent home often before their unit's tour was finished. So some returned home via sea and remained with their units back in Australia, and also for regulars. Others flew home alone and very suddenly were back on City Street, as I mentioned before. So it must have been much harder to readjust in that latter case. Also, those who came home individually usually missed out on the battalion march through the streets of whichever city when the main body of the unit returned home to Australia. So it's thought that while these factors may have had limited psychological problems during the deployment, it's probably just delayed them, bringing us to longer-term mental issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder and PTSD. 20 years after the war, so 1995, there were 7,135 Australian Vietnam veterans receiving benefits and treatment for mental health disorders. Of those, about 2,000 were diagnosed with PTSD, and that figure continued to rise over the next 30 years. By 2023, there were 18,654 Vietnam veterans receiving treatment and or compensation for PTSD. That's almost half of the surviving Vietnam veterans at that time. I think it's good that today there is much better help for those suffering PTSD. There's a much greater awareness and appreciation of it these days, but a continuing problem seems to be a lack of psychiatric professionals. There just aren't enough of them, and that's also affecting younger veterans too.
About 5 minutes.
Yes. On mental health veterans today, I think, owe a debt of gratitude to Vietnam veterans for their campaigning and practical work in setting up and expanding these services, starting with the Vietnam Veterans Counselling Service. We now have a successor organisation, Open Arms, and available now not only to Vietnam veterans but younger ones too, and importantly their families. Sadly, one serious repercussion of PTSD is an elevated risk of suicide. After the war, the Agent Orange Royal Commission found that suicide rates amongst Vietnam veterans were lower than for Australian males of the same age. This was despite anecdotal evidence among veterans that in the media the rate was alarmingly high, but reliable figures were hard to find. This was in the mid-1980s. However, later mortality studies conducted by DVA determined that between 1973 and 1995, 241 Australian Army Vietnam veterans had committed suicide, which was about 14% higher than the general population. This raised number was entirely among Army veterans, with the figures for Navy and Air Force being the same as for the general population. Perhaps the most alarming finding was that the children of veterans' suicide rate was 3 times higher. So it's continued to be a problem more in Australia, including those who have served in more recent conflicts. I really hope that the recent Royal Commission will bring some lasting improvements and real solutions. I'll just very quickly run through. That's over it. Just some basics on the long show, function 2020. The Australian War Memorial fully funded the project. We engaged an independent historian with some experience of researching and writing about both medical history and military history, Dr. Yule. The memorial employed a research project officer whose job was to provide the object admin as well as assisting Dr. Yule with the research. That was me. We also engaged an epidemiologist who examined hundreds and hundreds of scientific reports and literature over the years and provided assessments to Dr. Yule. We had access to a wealth of records held by DVA as well as National Library, National Archives and the Australian War Memorial. We talked to about it was over 100 veterans from all 3 services. Now that number of veterans is not statistically significant, but that wasn't our purpose. That's where the various DVA studies have surveyed so many veterans come into their own with they do have statistical significance. Our purpose was really to add some voices of personal experience to this newer history and get some general impressions. Personal voices. Overall, it took nearly 5 years of work between the beginning of 2016 when it was published in October 2020. While dissatisfaction among some Vietnam veterans with portions of the medical volume of the official history, the one published back in 1994, was a major factor in the memorial's decision to commission a new independent history, the Long Shadow would not be a part of the official history series hand apart, but the memorial did not interfere or try to influence what was published. Yule's findings were his own. The central finding was that, for the long shadow, was that the mental and physical health of Vietnam veterans is significantly worse than for other Australians of this same age group. Of the over 60,000 men and women who served, about 20,000 have died, more now since we finished it. And of the remainder, over 47,000 have a disability if accepted full compensation, most having multiple disabilities. Most common hearing loss, not surprising. Hearing loss 22,000, PTSD 18,500, tinnitus, that's just a ringing in the ears, over 11,000, and alcohol dependence and abuse, 6,276. Cancer incidence amongst Vietnam veterans is also 26 to 15% higher than for the general population. Just a few quotes that, from some of the veterans that we interviewed just to close with. So I think, closing, Australia's Vietnam veterans deserve our respect for their service in that terrible and long war. They did what their country asked of them, and they served with distinction and honour. And some came home bearing the scars, both physical and mental, sometimes facing indifference and scorn. Some carried that way for years to come. It is a shame that they were not shown more respect and appreciation sooner. Thank you.
Thank you very much for highlighting, again, a deeply personal area. And I'm sure if people have got some questions, we've got time for just a few. So,
Craig, thanks for that. I've read the book and I think it was very good work actually. But I can't remember, I haven't read it for a while. Was there a breakdown in terms of comparing the aftermath of the National Service and the regular soldiers? I'm an ex-Nasho, and for me the moral injury was being conscripted into the army in the first place. When I was 1 in 12 and all the other religions weren't conscripted and I was. And that was the thing that I felt most resentful about. And I was silent for 15 years. I wouldn't admit I was a Vietnam vet until about 1987. And I think...
Welcome Home Parade.
Yes, exactly. The two things, the Welcome Home Parade and the song, I was only 9 years. And those two cultural elements, I think, redeemed us to a large extent. But that, and just to finish this point, there were 40,000 national servicemen who didn't go to Vietnam, and they've been written out of their history. Nobody knows anything about them, nobody knows who they are. And I think...
And that's what you're looking to address, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, no, good points. Look, because of time limitations, I have to chop a few chunks out of this presentation. But look, there are parts of the Long Shadow which go into, I believe it's 6 years since we published it, so something's a little bit hazy. There is a chapter that's titled The Decade of Silence, which sounds like what you might be talking about.
Yes.
Where immediately after the war, you know, that's that period from the basically the 1970s, it's where people just clammed up about it.
Yeah, well, I think people went two ways: alcoholism, or they worked them.
Workaholism.
Workaholism.
Yes.
And I think I did the second.
Right.
But a lot of us made good use of the adversity.
Yes.
But a lot didn't.
Yeah, and there was stuff I had in here about the importance of the Welcome Home Parade as well. For many veterans seem to be the case, but unfortunately, I have to tell them to leave it out.
I saw some statistics that DVA provided in response to a question, and the answer came back in January 2021, and it said basically of the 60,000 served in Vietnam, 35,000 were still alive, and of that 35,000, 19,000 were TPI. Now people say, oh, TPI and half of them are bloody bullshit artists and so on. My own experience is for every one that got one that may not have been entitled, there were 2 that were genuine that never received anything. Is that percentage, over 50% of survivors are TPI? Is that normal? Is that an elevated
the
figure?
figures that you're talking about 2021, just after we published in 2020, so they're more up-to-date figures than what we used, but it does sound about right to me, with certainly the amount of surviving veterans. I'd have to double check.
I can send you the...
I mean, DVA report on this frequently, so it would be easy to find just by looking at their website and their yearly reports as to how many TPO cases there are and how that's increased.
I'd love to follow up on that because...
they publish it on their website. Should be able to find that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was going to ask it's a terrible question really, but the suicides of the veterans, and you mentioned subsequently the suicide of family members increases. Is there any indication that that is directly related to parenting, or whether it is the psychological phenomenon we know as of suicide, group suicide?
The term that I'm more familiar with is intergenerational trauma,
Yeah.
which may be similar to the suicide. But we're really talking about not that there's something inherently wrong with a parent that's passed on to a child. It's old-fashioned First World War.
It's kind of learned behaviour.
Yeah, but it's the trauma. I think it's more the trauma that the veteran brings home and what is imposed on that family life, which traumatises some children. A lot of them talk about a family environment which is run like with military discipline, and dad's moods are just, you don't know when dad's going to just suddenly explode. That sort of is common.
Yes.
Well, 2 things. Obviously, no need to mention it, but in the 60s, in the Australian Army, there was a huge drinking culture, but it was out there in the rest of society as well. And one of my friends came back from Melbourne, and he said, cruising back, relaxing in the sun, having a beer when you wanted it for 10 days or so was a fantastic element.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I think probably final question.
35 years ago, I finished supervising a trailblazing PhD on psychological casualties of Australian soldiers in World War I. I approached a notable Canberra military historian, not Peter Stanley or Michael McKinnon, to be one of the 3 examiners. He refused because he was contesting the relationship between Agent Orange and psychological effects on Vietnam soldiers. So this, and I think he was involved in the commission into that. So this is, say, 30 years ago, mid-1990s. When was that issue resolved? In other words, when was that scepticism about the relationship between the use of Agent Orange and the impact, the psychological and medical impact on Australian veterans resolved? Or has it not been resolved?
Yeah, I don't think it hasn't been resolved, but began to be resolved with the Edward Royal Commission because it addressed both those issues.
Yes.
Not to the satisfaction of everyone, though, but it continued to be debated. And I mean, even as recently as we had, that was a big debate that we had to deal with the long show because they were lingering controversial issues. And Dr. Yule did his best to provide a balanced view. It was really just looking to tell the history of what had happened. And everyone, with a lot of these issues, I was saying to somebody yesterday, A lot of these issues for veterans and people who've been involved in them for decades, they're never going to change their minds about them. They're firmly entrenched in what they believe. And that's going to be it.
Craig, thank you for your words. You brought some really serious underlying issues to us towards the end of the long day. We appreciate not only your research, but you're candid with your answers, and we'd like to show our appreciation. Thank you very much.